I realize there's a lot of very good talks on, so I'm very pleased you came and see this one. So the topic of this talk is Keystones for scheduled expansions. So my name's Visser, and I work for Grindy Gear Games on Path of Exile. Path of Exile is the only game we make, so scheduled expansions are super important to us because that, at the moment, is the only way the game sort of changes and still remains interesting, is that there are frequent expansions coming out. We are also recently came out in China and Xbox, which are new markets, but the bit I get to do production on is the sort of the core game where these sort of expansions are the thing. So this is a talk about expansions, why we have them, how they work, why it's important they're scheduled. So Path of Exile is an online action RPG set in the dark world of dark fantasy world of Raycast, made in Auckland. We're a 100-person studio, so if you're sort of going, oh, how big is your team? It's quite large. The game has grown over the last sort of 5 years, which we'll cover a little bit. Keystones specifically, why have I used this term? This is a very formal definition of keystone, so I'm putting this one up first to explain that I'm not quite using this definition. Wedge-shaped piece at the crown of an arch that locks the other pieces in place. Arch has a bunch of stones. It has some springer stones at the bottom, and then it has some other little wedges which are called voussoirs. And because I have more than one keystone, I should probably call this voussoirs of scheduled expansions, but that's not such an exciting term. So given that this one is too formal, we can go with other definitions. Urban Dictionary, which is an excellent place to go for definitions if you're very brave. Keystones, the best overall college beer, good taste, you can drink it till the sun comes up, and it's only like $13 for 30 of them. Maybe also not the ideal definition, but it is Friday afternoon, so I will try have some stories and anecdotes sort of hidden in the other stuff. The definition I'm actually going with is something more like Keystones are unique and powerful passive skill nodes that significantly impact the way a character is played, which is a thing in Path of Exile. This is from Gamerpedia talking about Path of Exile. This also lets me sort of give myself something to hang the chalk on when I get to sneak as many of the keystones from the game in as possible, and this also means I get to make it a little bit lenticular. So if you're here because this is about Path of Exile, and Path of Exile is what you care about rather than games in general or scheduled expansions, you'll be able to watch these little keystones go by and sort of see some interest in how I've snuck them in. For example, the keystone here is Conduit, which when you take it, you get to share your endurance, frenzy, and power charges with your other party members, and that's what I'm going to hope and do with this talk, so we'll see how I do. I mentioned the story time, so I'm going to talk about me a little bit first. I grew up fairly obsessed with games. When I was 10, there was a show called What Now, which I believe is still running, and on it, Alistair Kincaid, also known as Frank Flash, talked about Dungeons & Dragons, and when I was 10, this was like the most exciting thing in the world I had found out about. I went to Scorpio Books, which is in Christchurch and has since moved, fallen down in an earthquake, been rebuilt, and I believe moved to a container now. But this was the weirdest bookstore I knew of, and I knew they would have Dungeons & Dragons, and they did. If you walk past the sort of the little reception bit at the bottom of the shelf, there were a whole bunch of Dungeons & Dragons books, which were $30 each, which as a child I could not afford. I could afford this one, which is called Arduin Grimoire. This is the worst book for a 10-year-old to buy if they want to get into role-playing games. One, I knew immediately from the art style I should immediately hide it from my mother, and two, the rules made no sense. It was incredibly complicated. It assumed you'd played Dungeons & Dragons, and in the combat section, the author talked about how sort of visceral and realistic this was because of the time his friend went home in a body bag, well not home, went to the morgue in a body bag because he died while they were practicing sword fighting. And from there I knew that interesting, realistic combat was a good thing in role-playing games. Eventually I was able to save up for other games and was able to get Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and Warhammer, which was not a role-playing game, but it was very interesting in its own way, Traveller, Battletech, and I met the guy who worked on MechWarrior well here, so that was pretty cool. Rolemaster, which are these arms law and spell law books you see, don't mention the name of the game on them, which is an interesting and brave choice, but they were like the best thing. Despite these games I played, there were a bunch of other games I played, and in this I brought up with myself the ideal of a game. I had this sort of platonic form in my mind of what the perfect game was, and damn it, I was going to make one or discover one or whatever. This was in fact a misconception, and all the games I played proved that this was a lie, but still this is an idea I held on to for a very long time. These are what happened when you have a role-playing group that plays a specific role-playing game, is they release expansions that are super interesting and do nothing but completely disrupt your game, because they've got cool stuff in it that has nothing to do with the game you're playing that you immediately want to integrate in. And the games break and evolve, and everyone suddenly wants to make cooler things, despite the fact the game you're actually playing, they don't fit, but the books come out with cooler stuff. When I went to university, this game came out, and this was the best thing ever. And this released books at an incredible pace, kept me broke for a very long time. The books released new rules and story, and they had an overarching story between all the books that could literally not have anything to do with the game you were playing, and you soon worked out that couldn't have anything to do with the story you were telling yourselves in the games. It was just a sort of separate narrative you got to enjoy while buying the books and changing your game. But despite playing all these, I still had this very sort of ideal of an game, a single game that you were always working towards. I tried to make my own game, of course, and I've done this over many years. Only one real board game published, which involved the secret of working with someone else, which is, I found a secret for many things. Working with other people is how I actually finally managed to get stuff good enough to release. An endeavor I worked with a friend. It looks like this. It was published a few years ago, and the one thing I want to get from this talk is, in January it's going to be released again with a Kickstarter, so in January look out for this from Burnt Island Games and spend lots of money on it. That would be awesome. In some roundabout way from working on board games, I met Chris, who was running Grinding Gear Games, and they were working on this game called Path of Exile. Spoke with him about it while I played a bunch of Path of Exile, and eventually, when they went into closed beta, I started working on it. This is the nice logo for Path of Exile. I started working on it when it was in version 092, and I had a lot to do with the game design from 092 for a while afterwards, and I still do some game design, which I managed to sneak in, even though we've got 8 other designers who are chomping at the bit to do lots and lots, and for that matter, all the design. I enjoyed working on this a lot, still do enjoy working on it, but I still had this very concept of we are working towards the ideal version of this. What we are working towards is the ultimate game, and eventually we are going to sort of hone this game until it turns into sort of this platonic ideal of what is the perfect Path of Exile. We released at 1.00. There was a lot of iterative development, covered that stuff. What I learned from this, unbeknownst to myself, that the important bit was how to do the work of making a game. Regardless of the chaos that you were having with the iterations, you got to sort of sit down and do the work. And it wasn't an game we were working towards. Each version was its own thing. We got to do changes and do stuff. And I learned how to be a game designer, and I learned how to do production, which is a very useful thing. Then from there, we've released the game. We've hit the point where we can say, this is Path of Exile. It was on to expansions and expansion of the company. I think when we released, there were about 30 people in the company. We're about 100 now. As you can see, we scaled up during this expansion. And in fact, if you look at the number of people working on each expansion, you kind of think, given the main cost is the people working on it, each of these expansions probably cost as much as sort of the original design of the development of the game in the first place. This nice little graphic shows you some of these expansions. In theory, we have little minor expansions which have what we call a league that fit between these. They also have a bunch of game changes as well as a league, which is sort of a 3-month period where you can sort of play the game under a slightly different rule set. But these are the big named expansions. We tend to go large expansion, small release, large expansion, small release. Sacrifice of the Veil was where we were sort of finding our feet. Forsaken Masters was pretty interesting. We got to do some cool stuff. You'll note the big graphics change when we get to the Awakening. That was what we called 2.00, and we had a huge amount of changes for that. And then that was followed by Ascendancy, then Atlas of Worlds, and then 3.00, which is what we released this year. Huge undertaking, a lot of effort, and again, you'll notice the logo change because we've gone into a sort of a new era of Path of Exile. Because we're suddenly doing sort of these named expansions, there was a big sort of change of mindset for me, and I'm assuming the other people working on it, that it was no longer we're working towards sort of the ultimate version of this game. Each expansion was very much a standalone representation of the game at a point in time. It was sort of the expansion that mattered, was going to last for a while. The stuff would be kept, but then the next expansion would come along and it would be sort of its own thing and presented to the players in its own way. During this, every step we get to try and make each expansion better, and how we make the expansions better. We're working on continuously improving our processes and how it works. So much of the rest of this, I'm talking about some of the patterns and lessons about expansions and what we learned from them, and what sort of, to me, an expansion is and how we make them. So we'll start off with purpose of an expansion. Ultimately, an expansion is a communication of something. It is saying, here are a bunch of elements and they've got an identity. When we were working on the patches before, we sort of had named expansions. Each patch does contain a bunch of stuff, a bunch of game changes and systems and other things. An expansion is very much like a patch, which just has a bunch of stuff, but it gives it a single identity, a thing to sort of pin on it as a tool of communication. We're communicating with a bunch of people. For example, who are the audience of an expansion then, if we've got this named thing? First big one is marketing and media. It's very hard to talk about something if it doesn't have a name. When you go to the media, you want to say, we're doing something exciting. You want to talk to them and say, it's coming out in this many weeks, usually 4 weeks when we're talking to the media. You have a name for it. You get to talk about it, and you get to talk about everything to it in reference to this. It also means marketing the game, the people who are worried about that in the company get to sort of go, well, when Fall of Oriath comes, it'll have this, it'll do this, it'll do these awesome things. You're communicating to new players. One of the big messages of your expansion is, come play our game now. This is the perfect time to do so. We've just released a bunch of stuff. It's got a new name, as well as your main name. This is the perfect time to sort of get into the game and find out what it's about, and here's some things that might be of interest to you. Existing players, you also get to say, here's some new stuff for you. This is probably the hardest audience for an expansion because they're already playing your game. They already like it, presumably if they're playing it, although they don't always use those words. You have to say, this is what's in it for you, this is why you're going to stick around, here's some cool stuff. This one is actually super important, returning players. This is a time to talk to your players and say, this is the best time ever to come back. Come back for this. This has got, fixes some problems you may have had when you played before. And it says, when you played before, you liked this thing. You should come back and play, and you'll get to do that thing again. Or just remember us, come back and play, and we get to have an excuse to send you an email or communicate to you about this. There are other ways to sort of split the audience about how you can talk about it. I haven't really decided to fit that in because I was very constrained for space in this talk. Probably one of the more important audiences for your expansion as an entity, as a single thing you're communicating about, is the developers. Because you have to communicate them much earlier than you do these other audiences, and they have to know what they're working on, how it fits together cohesively, when it's coming out, and what it's meant to do. So when you're explaining the expansion to people, the first people you have to explain it to are the people who are going to make it. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about why schedule is important to us. The first reason is ritual, routine, and regularity. An expansion punctuates and sort of provides a system by which people know the game changes, rather than just stuff changes over time and I'm not quite sure how it works. There is a system for it. They know that every so often there comes a large amount of content. It's awesome if it arrives on a specific time that they know about, and they sort of get into the rhythm of it occurring. One of the best things about it is if you've got regular expansions, people will go, I haven't played Path of Exile for a while, I'll go check out what they're up to, go look at the news and see what's coming, and if there's an expansion coming, which if you've the way we organise our marketing is about a third of the time, and they'll get to go, and within the next month, an expansion is going to turn up. I'll find out what that's about and get re-excited for the game. When we went to being very rigorous about 3-month expansions was when we managed to sort of really get some growth going. Now, I wasn't allowed to put numbers on this chart from Chris, the CEO, but I have got the graph which shows the nice sort of curves. This first little bit at the beginning, where this nice big uptick, is a league we had called Talisman, and then every 3 months from there, we had another sort of release, and you get to see each one's larger than the last. This graph is specifically average concurrent players, which is probably the most sort of useful metric we use. We use average concurrent players rather than, say, daily actives, as for us, it provides much stronger correlations to, say, income than sort of daily concurrence. And also, it provides sort of big immediate changes when stuff happens. If you lose a bunch of players or you gain a lot of players, or the amount they play changes, it becomes very apparent on the graph. You'll see here we've got a very sort of strong sawtooth. When an expansion is released, there's these big upticks where we have a sort of huge inswelling of players. They play for a while, they're very engaged with it, they're exploring the content, and then some of these players sort of go away for a bit. The amount of time they're playing generally drops, so we have some players who sort of will play, I'm going to play 14 hours on the first day of this expansion, and then the next day they'll play 10 hours. And we'll have some people who just play 2 hours every night, which is why we have this sort of very strong growth, and then it sort of tails away. We found this actually works for us very well, because players get burnt out if they play your game all the time, but they know that in the next expansion they can come back, they can get heavily invested in it and play a bit. And you'll see each time in this regular cycle, most of the time, there's a few dips and troughs, the expansion comes along and the uptick's a bit bigger than the last. We grab a bunch of new players, and we grab a bunch of returning players who may or not have been there for sort of every sort of step along this cycle. You'll notice towards the end, there's a bit of a gap, which is when we released 3.0, where we just sort of weren't able to fit to a sort of a 3-month cycle for that. That particular expansion took way more than 3 months. It was started like several cycles before that. It was like the biggest investment for the company pretty much ever. We did do an open beta at about the 3-month mark, closed beta of the expansion content, but you'll notice that doesn't actually make any sort of tick on the graph. Usually because when people go in, they're not actually playing it for that long. They don't think of it as the real game until the actual expansion comes out. Happily, the content was good enough and marketed well enough and did enough for our players that despite the fact there was this gap, we didn't have a fall away, but we got our sort of biggest spike ever. Expansions also provide hope for the future. If there's anything the player perceives as wrong with the game, or they just hoped it was a bit better, an expansion is a sort of a thing to pin on. Maybe things will be better, maybe things will be fixed, maybe I'll get re-interested in the game in the expansion. It's sort of a point in time which you get to sort of imagine being better. And one thing I've noticed is things that don't exist yet are always better than what you have at the moment, because you tend to sort of imagine them as a sort of a perfect thing. So in this ritual, it's always a better point in the future. An expansion also, the regular schedule, gives players a fear of missing out. This is more on the past perspective. You wouldn't want to have missed one of these spikes, particularly when you're talking to your friends about it. Oh, of course I was there for that expansion. I need to go play it. It's out. It's in its 3-month thing. I need to be a part of that. And you do this because you know in the future you will have cared about this. So the hope for the future and the fear of missing out are sort of opposite sides of this. But it is a good reason to have sort of a big named, identified expansion. It is important to build up habitual behavior with your players. Every 3 months, an expansion comes out. I'm going to play it. This is one of these sort of things that sounds a bit nasty, but the habituation of this is my hobby, this is a thing I do, every 3 months there's a new expansion, I am going to play it, is a sort of a very strong builder for a community. This is a different game, this is Magic the Gathering, but every 3 months I buy one of these, whether I'm currently playing Magic the Gathering or not. This is what's called a bundle, and it contains a bunch of stuff from an expansion. It has all the expansion identity on it, it has a bunch of stuff from it, and this particular product, the bundle, is the best thing to buy if you don't play the game. It has all the art, it has a little booklet with all the cards, it has a few packs you get to open. This is actually a terrible product if you're actively involved in the game, because then what you want to do is buy a whole lot of cards or specific cards. But I have the habit of this. I wouldn't want to miss out on one of these. Every 3 months I'm getting one of these, which is Magic the Gathering sort of latest expansion. So this is something where I have a habit of buying this. Every 3 months I know I want to go and buy the next one. This is sort of habitual actions at play. It builds a history. Each time you release an expansion, you build a bit more history of your game, a bit more, this happened then. When you get to talk about what happened, you get to say, oh, I remember when this happened. Oh, where were you? Did you play during Sacrifice of the Veil? And I either get to say yes, blah, 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 or I get to say, well, no, I missed out on that. But there's sort of a long-term sort of history of the game, and you get to pin names on it and pin identities of what happened when. And ultimately, this builds a relationship between the player and the game. The game continues on, and you sort of get to know this game through a long period of time and get to talk about it and identify where you sit with it. You could have this, of course, without expansions, but the regularly scheduled expansions sort of give that ritual, that identity that they go, well, I was there for this and I was there for that, and they get to sort of identify where they were with, and it sort of builds up a history between you and the game, and therefore you've got a relationship with the game. So we've talked a bit about why we want scheduled expansions. What does an expansion look like? It has a very strong identity, and this can come from a variety of things. Initially and most sort of immediately is how it's presented in marketing, which involves things like colour, what your key art is. For example, if you have a personality attached to your expansion, it's very easy for people to identify it. They associate it with what the art is. And a name, which is super important, and hard to underestimate how much time you can spend on trying to work out what a name for an expansion is. There are some difficulties here. Your game probably has sort of an identified colour and format and art as well. Path of Exile is very brown. It has a certain way it looks. And then you need your expansion to look different to that, but yet still part of that game. And then each expansion you have has got to fit the identity of your game, yet be different to every other expansion. And you'll find by the time you've used your third different purple, your community starts to make jokes about it. And then they absolutely have. So you've got the identity of the expansion, which is in the colour and the art and the name. Mechanics and content, which I haven't really mentioned so far, but it's a huge part of what makes an expansion. It's got to be sort of represented by a variety of ways. Part of this is story. Now, our game is actually while it has a lot of story and it has a lot of lore, it's not at heart a very sort of storified game. It is about the mechanics, and it's about people making their builds. But one of the strongest ways to communicate sort of the identity of expansion is through its story. So it's hard to it's really important that the story is coherent. The story can be tied to the marketing and can be tied to sort of every part of an expansion. The game systems need to be tied to the expansion as well. You generally introduce new systems are changing, and they've also got to line up with the identity of the expansion. You also get to use all those narrative tricks that the nice narrative people get to use in story. You get to use them in your game systems as well. It's quite interesting. You get to sort of say, oh, here maybe is some foreshadowing from stuff. Purely mechanically, you can do all the same things you do in story with game systems, and it is in fact awesome when your players sort of identify that. As well as that, there is all the sort of the art and all the stuff that makes it up. Another important thing to note is when you introduce an expansion, it doesn't sort of go away at the end of it. Some of the stuff is transitory, and it is sort of for a period of 3 months, in our case, for the length of the expansion. But most of it hangs around and is permanent. You have to have people be able to identify where it's from. if they look at something, they can generally identify where it was, what expansion it came from. And this is also important when you bring back basically repeats of information in an expansion. You can essentially do a sequel to an expansion and have it sort of hook in with all the tropes in the story and of the game systems with the sort of with the previous expansion, which we've done a couple of times, and it works remarkably well. All this sort of stuff has to fit together with a certain amount of sort of just so-ness, which if you work at Grinding Gear Games, as a few of you do, is probably a word you've heard me use again and again and again. It's all got to just fit together perfectly, and it's awesome when it does succeed in doing that. We know the name of the expansion, the colours all fit together, the systems fit together, the story fits together. The best thing is when someone looks at all the information they've got in an expansion, they've started playing for a while, they go, wouldn't it be cool? Or if this is all true, I know what's going to happen next. And then that happens and they're correct because they've sort of seen how it all fits together and they understand that, well, if this is in this particular expansion, it's probably true this is there as well. And this sort of gives them a sort of a great sense of completeness and a few surprises as well. So we now know that regularly scheduled expansions are awesome and that they need to fit together and be these awesome just so things that are wonderful and whole, which sounds awesome. However, these two concepts, both individually awesome, do not get along very well with each other. If you want to make a just so perfect thing with things that fit perfectly together and you want to do this every 3 months, you're in for some very nasty surprises. There are a few ways to try and sort of make your just so perfect, everything fits together expansion in a 3-monthly cycle, some of them better and worse than others. There are costs to having your regular releases. It is, as we've noted, very awesome that if you have the regular release, your players know when it is, the marketing fits together, it all works perfectly, but to actually make it and get it out by then, which we've decided is a good thing, or we know it's a good thing because it helps the game, it is very difficult to do that. The first immediate thing is it's very easy to just go, we can always work a bit more to get this out in time. This is sort of the worst way to try and do this, and it always has costs that are reasonably terrible. The keystone from the game I've managed to use this for this is minion instability, which is kind of where I get to suggest if you treat people like minions, eventually they fall below 33% health and explode, which is what happens to your zombies when you've got minion instability. And earlier in my life, I studied strategic studies, and one of the interesting things there is you go, why in all these old wars do people do frontal assaults when if they read anything about any strategists at all, they know they do flanks? And the reason is it's much easier to order people to do a frontal assault and just charge than it is anything else. So crunch very easily becomes your sort of fallback method for meeting deadlines. This has tremendous costs, the worst of which is you make more mistakes and it usually leads to crunch immediately after your release when you try and fix up all the things. And when you should be working on the next expansion, you're having to deal with the fallout of that. Another big problem is you get technical debt. As you come up to a sort of a release date, you're trying to get everything fitting together just so. Shortcuts can be taken to just get things working. Most of this is from programmers, but it happens in other things as well. So you don't want one of your animators rushing a rig because you will deal with that hell for much time to come. In code, I heard the term from a programmer. It was one of our high-level ones saying, every day I sit here and make the code base worse. Literally, they're coming up to a deadline. Everything they were doing was getting the stuff needed for the expansion. Everything was making things worse in the code base and harder to work with and more difficult. The difficulty of a quick fix to get something out eventually leads to refactors. I have very strong opinions about refactors, and that opinion is basically you should not do them. Programmers obviously disagree with this, but it is a whole lot of effort and then a whole lot of testing to get things to, from my perspective, exactly where they were. Now, I realize they do improve things and make it easier for work to be done in the future, but it doesn't fit in with a 3-month schedule. And worse than that, and I've seen this several times, is programmers go in and they refactor something, And then they find out why they did that thing in the first place. They wrap their head around the problem that they took this quick fix for, and they went, that quick fix wasn't actually so bad. There are much worse things I could have done to fix this, and often some refactors pay off and some don't, and they do require a ton of testing. So anything where there's a sort of a crunch deadline, or there's a quick solutions to problems in a 3-month cycle, and a quick fix is made, you tend to pay for it later. Quality reduction, much better than having technical debt and leading to crunch, is just reducing the quality of what you're doing. This sounds like a terrible thing to do, but often this is a better choice than the other things you've got there. This does lead to post-release fixes, and as you're running things close up, you have to necessarily reduce the amount of quality assurance you're doing, which means you're then eating into your next cycle for an expansion. This is the correct answer, and it's the one that feels the worst, which is dropping features and content. If you want everything to fit together and be this nice, holistic, just-so thing, you've planned to do something which isn't designed for really dropping features and content from. Also, the features and content you've come up with are good things. People are very attached to them emotionally and they want them in the game. Usually this is a decision you have to make very early, but it's very painful to do so, and it's very hard to work out when you are dropping features and content from upcoming stuff. One interesting thing I will note is sometimes when you drop a feature or some content, people decide they're going to do it anyway, and they take some of their time and they make the feature anyway and can go, see, it's good, we need to get it in. This cannot happen if you're running with the assumption that there is crunch happening. Now, well, this is still bad if they use their own time for it and they put in all these extra hours, but one advantage of this is if you're not impinging on their time, they are making a judgment about their resilience and the importance of this feature themselves, and it just sort of, people tend to survive that better than when they sort of feel compelled to do so. But generally, one of the more important things I do is killing features and content from going into expansions, and it always hurts, and it's not like we should drop the bad features. You are literally always ending up dropping good stuff, because you cannot afford to have all that good stuff in your expansion. So how then do you have a list of things that you can afford to drop while still having an awesome sort of holistic just-so expansion? One way to think about this is you need core features, things you're not going to drop, and enumerated elements attached to those which have elements you can drop out, can be tested. The supporting itemized content is really where a lot of the power from this comes. If we have a list of, this is a core feature of this expansion, it has these 20 things attached to it, we're going to aim to get 20 in, but if it's 14, it's not so bad. If it's 8, it might look a bit shady, but it'll still work. And if it's going really badly, the players will never notice that there were only 4, that there weren't intended to be only 4 of these, as long as we dress them up a bit. You need to take time to prototype and test your content. That way you can identify the bad stuff first, which means you want to do it sort of as roughly and as easily as possible and identify which things you should drop before you even really start working on them. Building one to throw away. So this sounds ridiculous after we've just talked about we want to do stuff every 3 months, we want to be able to throw away features and stuff. But really one of the ways to make stuff which is going to make it in time, be good, lovely, holistic and whole, is to do early work which is probably not going to be good enough, and you can then go, let's just redo it properly. We don't do as much of this as we'd like, and we use so much reuse. When we build one to throw away, we'll generally stick the one we've built to throw away in the game in some other way. But this really helps you building something early so you know what's wrong with it so you can do it again later. One sneaky way to do this is you do something poorly one expansion, you go, we can kind of redo this again later, only better. And then there's the question of creation, completion, and polish. Now what I mean here is specifically when you're working to a deadline and within a 3-month period, it is very hard to see what is wrong with something. If you have one team work on the creation of something and it's slightly different people, or just sort of with task swapping, someone else doing the completion and polish, one, they get to not sort of be tied up by the deadline. They get it at a point in time, and then they're the person responsible for making it better. And then they're not working from nothing up to something that's final. They get something and they go, this is close, but I can make this actually releasable. I'm not sure why this saves time, but it does. If you have sort of a pipeline which has one person sort of building something or making something, and then someone else who has the sort of responsibility for completing it and polishing and making it sort of a thing for release. Certainly I mostly see this in design because it's the area I work in most. We have someone who's responsible for sort of the development of something and someone who's doing the initial creation of it. You end up with much better stuff, and weirdly, despite the fact you have this sort of double cycle of stuff, it comes out a lot faster ultimately, and I've seen it in the other team somewhat as well. So we've discussed how we make this all work together. How do you get it to it? So you get to make one to throw away, and you get to prototype and test. The first thing is early planning. Ideally, before your last expansion is done, you should be already working on the next one. We're actually not so good at that, but as soon as you've sort of got one release out of the way, you've got to be planning on the next one, ideally earlier, and you need to be able to sort of feeding work into people when they're sort of ready to be thinking about the future content. This one we've found super useful. This is partially size now that we're 100 people, but having someone who is responsible for each feature and they follow up on it. Someone who is sort of the bottom line for this. It divides up the work and they get to be someone you can sort of ask about it. Someone who's leading a particular feature. You've got your list of features for your expansion. Separate from the feature leads, found it super useful if there is someone who is ultimately responsible for what gets out the door, that does that final assessment and is not as attached to it because they haven't been working on it all this time. And for us, that's the sort of founders of Grinding Gear Games, Chris, Jonathan, and Eric, who get to sort of say, this is the features in the expansion, I am responsible for this one, I get to assess it and sort of look over this feature and say, yes, this is looking good, and look into it every so often and have that information given to them. Communication. Now, weirdly, as a very systems-oriented sort of designer originally, and then sort of doing this production thing, which looked like spreadsheets at first, I've since discovered that this mostly involves talking to people, repeating the information about the expansion to the developers over and over again until everyone thinks you're very boring, and that, well, everyone knows that, why are you telling me this again, is the first secret to this communication. And the second thing is getting all the various people involved in the steps in this talking to each other. You need to know when things are going to be late, when to cut features, how to line up all the different parts of an expansion sort of coming through the organization so that the work gets done. So communication is sort of the one secret that's probably the biggest of all these into getting sort of a holistic just so thing out within a 3-month period. Tracking and reassessment. The reassessment being important there. Itemizing where things are at, because we've got our feature list and we want to cut stuff out, and being able to track where things are at is also a strong part of this. It facilitates the communication. And if we want to say we're cutting features, you need to track where they are. We need to know you're on track, and actually have deliberate times where we are assessing things for the purpose of, are we going to do this? Are we getting this out in time? Do we need to reassess what we're doing? Conclusions for this. So the first one of these is about the early part of this, where I discussed the nature of games and then they're not a sort of a platonic whole, or at least the kind of game I'm working on, and the games I like often are not. Games have never just been games. They're not just sort of these singular things we work to and we've sort of got this mental idea of a perfect game. They're products, yes. They're services, they're stories, they're worlds. They're things we have relationships and sort of ongoing things. So I've got to discuss production and all this sort of thing. But for the players, an expansion and a release are something which helps them understand their game as a story, as understand it as a world, and have a thing that they happily have a relationship. A lot of this is just perspective and mindset. Part of this is me discussing my issues in understanding what was going on and adjusting my mindset of how we deal with a game as a service, as it were, and dealing with expansions. Dealing with sort of the regular release is often just a sort of matter of perspective. It is sort of mindset. What are we doing? How do we do it? What is the nature of the sort of services we are providing? And then, unfortunately, some of it just comes down to work and discipline. And in the discipline, I'm including the discipline to know that it's not just work and how to do it and how to make sure you're sort of not tapping people too much and making sort of the most of the skills and not making stuff, not putting the effort into things that are not going to fit in the sort of the regular schedule. This is a list of some keystones from the game I didn't manage to sneak in. So, Ghost Reaver, Iron Reflexes, and Blood Magic, which I had all sorts of clever ideas of how to fit them in. But if instead of questions, and welcome to ask questions, anyone who's sort of familiar with these wanted to have ideas of how these associate with the topic, you're also welcome to tell me that. Thank you again. My name is Carl de Visser. Welcome to write to me at carl@grindinggear.com. That's my Twitter address. And are there any questions?
Is there ever, you've done so many expansions now, is there ever a kind of ennui that digs into the team about this being a never-ending road into the future? Because, as someone who plays a ton of board games, sometimes I feel that when a board game is successful, it has to have expansions because it's part of the business model. And that sometimes the expansions actually weaken what was something amazing and brilliant in the first place. It gets over complex, or it somehow dilutes the original genius. How do you counter the risk of the team losing what made something so fantastic in the very first place?
So,
does that make sense?
Yes, it does. So part of that, I think, is being aware of those audiences, that you're not just sort of accreting systems on top of each other and accreting information that are only for your existing players. So we remake a lot of stuff, which also gets a bit of anger. Now, also for the ennui, I know that at the end of every expansion, I just generally have a sort of, I need to breathe, I need to just do some sort of mundane stuff. And I know a lot of other people in the team sort of have that moment, and it's sort of like, okay, the grind's beginning again. And I don't mean there as sort of, I just mean the grind as in the repetition. But on the other hand, the desire to make that exciting and interesting, it sort of gives you a moment to sort of go, oh, well, how is the next one exciting? How is it interesting? And also doing work on, well, we've got new players every time. We don't want to overcomplicate it. Although handily the game, part of its charm is its sort of Baroque messiness. So we get sort of a bit more sort of reason to throw stuff in. But that being said, the game always has to be accessible as well. And at the same time, when we're releasing into new markets like onto Xbox and into China, that's very sort of, for this particular expansion where we're sort of going, we're changing everything. Oh, and you can totally play this and it's, straightforward and there are easy ins.
Because there have been so many expansions now, is the team sort of have that assumption that with say if there was a feature that something really like had to get cut for this expansion, does that sort of, do they get the feeling that they can then add that into another expansion?
Yes. So, for example, Ascendancy, which was quite a big expansion and our players enjoyed, was a single feature line from the expansion beforehand. And the fact that it turned it into an entire expansion by itself actually showed us how much hubris we had trying to go, well, we're trying to change stuff up, we'll just add this in as well. And that very much was that. And as well, dropped features are usually actually delayed features. So there's a bit of effort when you try and make something fit perfectly with an expansion and then it's going in the next expansion. And sometimes our players pick up on this. We get caught out sometimes and they go, this was obviously designed for that, which is, it's nice to go, oh, they're noticing all our little features and twiddles that make it all fit together. But on the other hand, you get kind of caught out and go, well, yes, actually it was, but we tried to make it fit with this thing instead of that thing.
It's kind of answered by that last question, but I was going to answer that each sort of expansion was approached as a separate piece of work from sort of the brainstorming phase, or whether you had a list of features that you just kind of pluck stuff out, or you just started planning what you do for that next sort of 3 months.
It's sort of remarkably blank slate, as in this one's got a sort of standalone. Jonathan and Chris are very keen that there is stuff that's exciting for the media, so there's the amount of ideas that get thrown away as we try and find something good, while also having something that fits the core game. Related to the on-way mentioned earlier, one of the depressing bits is early on we kind of got to experiment and fail a bit more, whereas now we go, well, we know what works and what doesn't. But that being said, some of the successful bits is actually we've gone, let's actually be a bit more adventurous here and take a risk, and they've often been some of the bigger payoffs as well.
Where do your ideas for expansions come from? Is it sort of a top-down thing, or can anyone on the team pitch an idea? Or
That's something we're still, I think, trying to work out. There's sort of been a mix of approaches. There's been lots of ideas thrown, and then occasionally it's been taken sort of very centralised. But generally, there's a whole lot of ideas suggested and put forward, and then they sort of get assessed by the sort of the owners of the feature and the like sort of the founders and various sort of senior people, and assessed, and then they get churned through and remade and rebuilt, and ideas get put back. But there's one thing there is not is a shortage of ideas. Ideas, you know, there are a lot of people who are very keen and excited to be sort of creative about stuff.
Yeah, just in terms of adding expansions to the game, you did touch on like people filling the code, but it's missing and missing, and that sort of gets built up on the initial release. Do you tend to try and plan around adding systems that are more modular in nature so that they can sort of be adaptable and be more robust, or is there too much pressure to sort of get a release out every 3 months and sort of have to ship content in there?
So handily, as the team's got bigger and we've tried to do more things, there's been a very strong driver to sort of separate elements. The fact that we had the Xbox release meant the fact that the sort of the engine and the gameplay code often muddled together a bit, and some of those earlier things just wasn't going to fly anymore, and we were lucky that some senior programmers joined us who were very good at sort of like separating engine code and the gameplay code, and there has been sort of more of a push to sort of separating those elements. Handily, I don't need to understand most of that, but it does happen. And as well as that, there has been pushing systems for other team, like the designers spend a lot of their time making bosses and doing AI and stuff, which to them is, you know, very much scripting sort of stuff. But for the programmers now, that's just data. AI code is just data as far as the programmers are concerned. Cool, thank you.